Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Greg Hudnall, and I just want to say thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us for this wonderful webinar that we've been planning for some time. We're excited to have Gina here and her expertise, especially with the challenges that we're facing as educators and mental health experts around the country and around the world. We want to say, take care of yourself. And take this time to relax and listen to an amazing presentation. It will be recorded, so you'll be able to use it with your Hope Squads or any other organization that you would like to later on. Feel free to, in the chat room, to ask questions, or if you have any concerns, and Abby and Kathy will be monitoring those. So I'm going to turn the time over to Abby, who's going to introduce Gina. And once again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Greg. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm really excited to welcome our panelist, Dr. Gina Messina. A little background on Gina. She's an author, educator, and thought leader, and she's spoken at multiple universities, organizations, and conferences around the world. Most notably, she presented at the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations on multiple occasions, and she's been in the national news circuit with appearances on MSNBC, PBS, NPR, and SiriusXM Radio. She has been welcomed to the TEDx Stage and has been featured in the Washington Post, Huffington Post, the Associated Press, the Boston Globe, and other news organizations across the country. So today, Gina will be talking about grief and loss, and more importantly, how to help yourself and others move past your grief. So I'll turn it over to Gina, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Abby, and hello, everybody. It's really, really great to be here. And I wanted to start off with just a brief reflection in thinking about the time of year that we're in at the moment, excuse me, and knowing that many of us are in the midst of dealing with a lot of snow, right? A lot of snow and a lot of cold. And when I was younger, I used to love all of the seasons, which is easy to do when you're a child. But as I've gotten older, I really appreciate the warm weather and find myself just wishing the cold days away. And I think a lot of us feel that way, especially when we're getting dumped on like this and we're seeing actually some real devastations happening around the nation because of the weather. And Parker Palmer is a wonderful author who has a terrific reflection about the seasons that I really appreciate. And he talks about the fact that, in the wintertime, it's cold, it's dark, we're kind of hibernating, and we're just waiting for the light to come back. We all appreciate when it's light outside all day and we get to be outside and enjoy the sun and appreciate the beautiful blooming flowers and the trees and all of those wonderful things. But an important point that he makes is that we really need to think about the fact that during the winter, when it is cold, and when it is dark, it gives us an opportunity to rest and reflect. And when we don't have all of the beautiful blooms available for us to gaze on, we also see that there's a lot revealed when the world seems to be bare, right? So I want to encourage all of us to think about what we really want to be reflecting on during this time period, and what opportunity for healing and giving ourselves space to heal and to rest during this time, how we can do that for ourselves and recognize it as offering us something that's really beneficial. So I just wanted to share that because it's been on my mind and I thought it would go well with our topic. And I also just wanted to share, I titled the presentation Beyond Survival based on one of my favorite quotes by Joan Baez. And she says, all of us are survivors because we're alive. If we're living, we're survivors. But what does it mean to be to transcend survival? What does that look like for us in our daily living, in the different things that we are dealing with, and our challenges, in our grief? What does it look like to transcend survival? And I think that's such a critical question, and one that we can carry with ourselves as we're working through our own moments. So to begin, I thought it was important to define some concepts, because I often share this with my students, that we use language very freely, and we use words in ways where we think we know what they mean, but we don't always quite know how to define them. If we're challenged on it, we just know that we use them. And so when we're talking about grief, there's a lot of language that comes into play that we might not fully understand. But when talking about the term grief itself, we're really talking about the idea of the loss of expectations. And that's a very kind of a simplified way to say it, but also I think one that really identifies a number of ways for us to think about what we're experiencing and how to articulate that. Grief is really, about the process of loss that we're going through. And it's different for each of us. It's different than trauma. A lot of times we talk about trauma and grief, whereas trauma is an actual event that can lead to physical or emotional or psychological harm. And grief often is the response to that trauma. And grief comes to us in a number of ways. We're all grieving different things. And the worst possible grief that you can experience is your own. And that's something that's really important for us to understand, because we're very good at downplaying whatever it is that we're dealing with. And in doing that, we don't give ourselves the space to really work through our grief process. So understanding that your grief is your own, and that is the worst grief that you can be experiencing, your own process. It can be the loss of a loved one. It can also be the loss of a job, maybe a divorce, or a breakup. It could be a poor financial situation. And those are the kinds of things we're all dealing with in the moment, living through a year of a pandemic and still waiting to see some real progress with the vaccine coming. And so we have a personal level of grief that we experience. And we're also part of a collective process of grief, in that our nation is grieving together, our world is grieving together. The number of traumas, which I think it's very fair to characterize it that way, the number of traumas that we are experiencing living through a pandemic. So some of us have had personal loss of a loved one. Some of us are grieving not seeing our loved ones because we've been distanced for so long. And some of us are grieving our professional positions. As Greg said in the beginning, so many of us are educators, we're counselors, we're working with students in a time where our workload has certainly exploded, right? And we're doing so many more things. And we also feel that it's not always appreciated, and that we're often putting our own health at risk in order to do the things that we really care about, that we really feel passionate about. So it is a time for grieving for us in a number of ways. And we experience that as being acute or integrative, meaning acute being very intense, an intense experience of grief. And integrative is where we're hoping to get the opportunity to know that we are grieving and it is there, but we're able to grieve while also engaging in our daily lives, that we're able to manage our workload, taking care of our children, being parts of our family, whatever that looks like for us. And also grief can be intuitive or instrumental. And so this is really about the ways that we express our grief. Intuitive is about being very outward with our grief and being more emotional with our grief, whereas instrumental is generally more inward and more cognitive, and more about us processing our grief in an inward way. So in thinking about the ways that we respond to grief, I really love this image because we all think there's going to be this process that we go to. We hear about the different models of grief, the stages of grief, the tasks of grief. I'm going to talk about those in a minute. And we think we just have to hit on each of these and then we're going to be done. And it is not like that, right? Each of us experiences grief in a very distinctive way. And each of us has our own process with grief. And looking at it as kind of a big knotted mess is much more appropriate than a straight line. So I think sometimes when we're talking about the stages or the tasks, it can be really confusing for us because we think that I'm going to do this, 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 and this, and I'm going to be good. And that's not how it works. And so it's important for us to be aware that we're going to have setbacks, and that's okay. It's normal. It's part of our process, and not to be discouraged with that. So I think a lot of us are probably very familiar with the stages of grief. We hear about these a lot, and they're categorized in this way that we go through these particular stages of shock, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And again, it creates the illusion that we're going to be like, oh, I'm in the bargaining stage right now. I only have 2 more phases to go through. Not quite. The tasks of grief is another formula that looks at the ways that we experience grief and we work through a particular process, thinking about the different tasks that we have to complete. But again, that looks different for all of us. And a lot of times we're repeating these tasks and repeating these stages. So there's a PDF that went out to you that has a little more information about stages and tasks in it with links that you can click to take a look at those. Since we have a limited amount of time, I didn't want to spend too much time talking specifically about this, but just to give you a little bit of a background and an understanding of the ways that we work through these. This is also called the dual model, which I think might be the best way to think about the ways that we work through our grief process, because it acknowledges that we're kind of moving back and forth through experiencing acute grief through and moving back to integrative grief, right? It's kind of a process, and it acknowledges more of how that process is not very clean cut. But this is another model that explores this, that gives us somewhat of an understanding of what we can anticipate for ourselves and also what someone else may be going through that we're looking to support. So what I want to give the most attention to is thinking about the ways that we navigate grief, because again, we all navigate the process in our own time, in our own way, and experience it in a very distinctive way. But to begin navigating grief, the most critical thing that we need to do is actually name what we are grieving. Because a lot of times we're really not fully aware of what it is that we're grieving. A lot of times our grief process encompasses more than one particular loss. There's a number of things that we're dealing with. And so by naming it and acknowledging it, we give ourselves a better opportunity to be able to work through that process. And it's a scary process. Naming our grief, acknowledging our grief can result in triggering significant emotion for us. And for many of us, we want to think about ways that we can avoid that. We don't want to feel the pain. We don't want to deal with going through this process. And sometimes we practice unhealthy coping habits, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. But most critical is that we need to give ourselves the space to name it and to know that we're going to go through a process, and know that that process, while is difficult, is also very healthy, very normal and very much needed to allow us to get to an integrative process and get to a space where we're able to move past a period of bereavement, which really refers to the time period that we're actually grieving, right? Or move past our mourning, which is really like a public expression of our suffering. These processes that we need to move through are critical. And so it really starts with naming and being able to express exactly what you are grieving. Now, there are unhealthy and healthy coping mechanisms, as there is with anything. And to think about what is an unhealthy process, certainly we do a number of things. We would think about, this image I really appreciated because it looks at the ways that we engage socially. And when we think about our social engagement, when we are coping in a negative way, we have, a habit of really closing ourselves off. And that is not a good thing to do, to be alone. Of course, we need space to process, and sometimes we need alone time, but you don't want to close yourself off from the people around you, from your loved ones altogether, because you're leaving yourself in a space with no support. But on the other hand of that, if you're somebody who is, really going to the other extreme, going out every night, it says partying every night, which looks like different things for many of us. But we want to find a balance, and that is really critical. But also with unhealthy coping mechanisms, we do often avoid experiencing our grief, and we kind of stuff that down and try to shove it aside, and thinking that we're not going to have to deal with it. And all that results in is leading us to a lengthier and often a more problematic process, because it gives us more to deal with. And so interestingly, doing this isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes we need to avoid so that we can get through the workday, or so that we can parent our kids. There's going to be spaces where we do some avoiding, and that's okay. It's when we try to completely avoid something and think that we're never going to have to deal with it that we have a real problem. Obviously, things like substance abuse can become a very serious issue and a negative coping mechanism. And so we want to really acknowledge the ways that we are trying to deal with our grief and recognize what's healthy for us, what is not healthy, and how we can manage that. So when we're thinking about the grief process and what it looks like to really express our grief, we need to give ourselves permission to feel it. So just as we were talking about moving past avoiding and giving yourself permission to feel the loss that you're experiencing, whatever that means to you, and whatever that is made up of, because again, it can be a number of things. So again, going back to the example of the fact that we're living through a pandemic, for some of us, that's the loss of a loved one. It's also a shift in the way that we experience family, a shift in the way that we experience community, a shift in the way that we go to the grocery store. Sometimes I find myself moved to tears at the grocery store, just looking at everybody wearing masks and thinking, like, what has happened, right? So many things have shifted for us that there's a number of things that we're dealing with. So we want to acknowledge that and allow ourselves to feel it. And also we need to give ourselves the space to let go of guilt, because that is a huge, huge part of working through grief. Many of us experience guilt, and for a number of reasons. And we really need to give ourselves the space to think about why we feel guilty, why we're carrying that guilt, and how we can work through that. And one of the things I think is really important is for us to give ourselves the space to think about our memories. What are the memories we have? What are those good times? How can we remind ourselves of those times, the things that we did do for the people that we love or for the particular situation? What did we do? maybe we can write a letter. If you've lost someone that you love and you're feeling guilt, what do you want to say to that person and why? Writing a letter is a great way to express those feelings. Not all of us are writers, and I can appreciate that. And that process might look differently for you. Maybe it's not writing a letter. Maybe it's recording a message. Maybe it's making a TikTok video, right? I mean, we all do things in different ways, but giving ourselves the space to say what we need to is really important. And also asking for feedback from the people around us, because oftentimes we are in a particular space that we can't really be able to fully reason the situation. And having people around us to give us that feedback and say, here is all the wonderful things you did do. Here are the things that you could not have known. Sometimes we need people around us to remind us of that, because by carrying guilt, we are creating a very painful process for ourselves, number one. And we're creating a difficult process for the people that we love and that love us. So thinking about that and allowing ourselves to know that we do not have to feel guilt is important. It might take us a bit to get there, but it's important, and it's something that we need to pay attention to. So I also always love to talk about experiencing our emotions in really creative ways. Something I was sharing with Greg and Kathy and Abby is that I really love this television show called Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist. And I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's a new show. It's in its first season still, I think. And I love this show because I am a big music person, and there's great music in the show, and it's a lot of fun. But what the show is really about, it's really about the ways that people express their grief, and how they express their grief through music and through song as being a creative way to process things. And it's something I really appreciate about the show, is that it acknowledges how real these emotions are for us, and the different ways that we can work through them. And so thinking about for yourself what that looks like. Maybe music isn't your thing. Maybe instead it's doing art. Maybe you're an artist, or maybe you like to journal, or maybe you like to express yourself through social media processes, right? I mean, I have a lot to say about social media, in that it could be positive and it could be negative. But for some of us, it's where we find a space to create, to be creative and express ourselves. And if that's your space, then that's a good thing. So I talked, about negative coping mechanisms and what it looks like to express our grief in a positive way. And something else we really need to be thinking about is how we are taking care of ourselves. And I often say, I think the phrase self-care is kind of watered down, and we use it a lot, and it means a lot of different things. And we talk about it in a lot of different ways. And so I think it's important that we know what that means for each of us. And what we do need, or if we're taking care of someone that we love, what do they need in that moment, being able to provide that support. But I always like to say that I think self-care and self-maintenance are different things. They're different things, and both are necessary. Self-maintenance is, you need to drink enough water. You need to eat healthy things, right? You should have some broccoli in your diet along with the chocolate cake that you might be eating, right? We need to do good things for our bodies, get enough sleep, get enough exercise. And we all know what that is, but knowledge isn't enough. We need to put it into action. I always like to make the joke about the sleep expert who knows everything there is about to sleep, but he often is up all night watching somebody else sleep and doesn't take care of himself. And a lot of us are very good at that, having the knowledge and not putting it into practice. So engaging in self-maintenance and giving ourselves what we need, but also engaging in self-care. And so for me, that piece of it is the chocolate cake. It is, maybe going to the spa. It is doing whatever we need in the moment that isn't something that maybe we do every day. But acknowledging what self-care looks like for you moment to moment, day to day, week by week, month to month, because there are different things that we can engage in different time periods. So like moment to moment, day to day, I think a lot about like giving myself a few minutes to just have quiet space. If you'd like to do yoga, maybe it's like ensuring that you have time to do yoga every day. Whatever that looks like for you, identifying it and being able to know when you are able to engage in these kinds of things, and how often, what your time frame is, but figuring it out. Giving yourself the space to splurge sometimes is really important. To dance. Again, I go back to Zoe's extraordinary playlist where these people are dancing and singing and acting out their emotions. It's very, very powerful. Or journaling. So one of the things that I assign in a lot of my classes is a daily gratitude journal. And for some students, it is groundbreaking and something they continue to practice after the class. And for others, it's just not their thing. And that's okay. So giving yourself an opportunity to figure out what that looks like for you, and know that drinking your water, eating healthy, taking care of your body, sleeping enough is so important, but it's different from self-care. And you're allowed to give yourself permission to eat the chocolate or to splurge on whatever it is that you need, and make that space for yourself every day. And finally, thinking about ways that we can reach out to others for support, or if it's somebody that you truly care about that is grieving, how you can support them. It's an interesting thing in our culture, in our society, is that for those of us who are support persons, we often don't know what to do. And we feel uncomfortable with the process. We don't know what to say. I'm sure, many of us have experienced the loss of a loved one, and, some of the reactions that we get that are meant to be supportive don't necessarily feel supportive, right? We know people are well-intentioned. And oftentimes for ourselves, when we want to support someone, we are very well-intentioned, but we don't know what to do. It's an uncomfortable process. And that does have to do with our own social process and the way that we are existing in our culture. So I like to think, for us to really consider the different ways that we can support someone. And I think what's most critical is, who is that person, and what do you know about them, and what do you know that they're going to need? And sometimes we don't have the answers, and we're going to fumble our way through and do our best. But, for a lot of us, making a simple phone call is such a big deal in the age of texting and social media, especially, for persons who aren't so engaged in texting and social media. To get a phone call from you is a really big deal. And something so simple can make a huge difference. And on the same thought, for others of us, answering the phone might feel really overwhelming, and feel like I just don't even feel like I can manage talking on the phone right now. But to get a text message just to say, I'm thinking of you, I'm here for you, when you're ready, is a wonderful, wonderful thing to hear. I received a letter from someone, a handwritten letter recently, And it was the most touching and moving thing to me. In a world where I am on email all day, every day, and texting and whatever else, that somebody took the time to sit down and hand write a letter to me. That takes a lot of thought, I feel like. I feel like it's very thoughtful to do that. And it costs the cost of a stamp, which in some way is like, email is free and you actually paid for a stamp to send this to me. And on the other hand, if you're sending a letter, it's only the cost of the stamp, right? So that's, there's things that I feel like we think of in a nostalgic way that we can continue to engage in today's world and know that it's very much appreciated. So one of the things that I do very often with people that I care about is that I share music with them. I said, I am a music person. It's really important to me, and an important way to me that I express myself, and a way that I engage day to day that I feel like allows me to transcend survival. And so if I hear something that I think is really meaningful and moving, I will share it with someone and say, I don't know if you'll have time to listen to this, but this really made me think of you and I wanted to share it with you. That might look like something different for you. It might look like a poem or a book or a meme, right? What are these little things that we can do? Because I think that sometimes we forget that oftentimes it is the smallest acts done with love and care that have the greatest impact. And we need to remember that those small acts are so important, because sometimes we're like, well, why, they don't really need a text message from me or a phone call or whatever it is, right? They're probably hearing from so many other people. It is those small things that really, really do matter when we're looking to give support. And so I said, deliver groceries. Like right now, I have, my neighbors are elderly, they're in their 80s, and they're amazing and wonderful people. But I'm going to the grocery store and there's a blizzard outside, and they have a lot going on. And can I just drop some groceries off on their doorstep, right? Just to reach out and let them know that I'm here for them. But simply listening, again, I think is one of our most critical acts, because a lot of times when we are thinking about supporting someone and what we can do for them, the greatest gift I think that we can give to somebody is to listen and to not try to tell somebody what they should do. Because oftentimes, and I think, if you've been there, you know what it feels like. You just don't want to hear it. You just want somebody to listen to you. And that's not to say that we shouldn't share guidance along the way, and think of ways that we can engage in guidance in a positive way. But listening is so, so critical, especially when we're talking about kids today. Not today, kids in general, right? Not just today, but in general. We all engage with kids of different ages in different ways. Some of us are parents, some of us are teachers, some of us are guidance counselors, or we're siblings. We engage with kids of different ages in different ways, and kids at different ages understand things in different ways and need different kinds of support. But I think what's really important to know is that children, whether you're 3 to 6, 6 to 12, or 13 to 18, children do not have the skill set to work through very complex issues, complex grief. It's something that they're growing into. It's something that they're learning. It's something that we are a part of their journey in. And so thinking about where they're at in their process is important, and recognizing that oftentimes when kids are coping with grief, a lot of their coping mechanisms are probably going to be negative. negative or unhealthy, in avoidance, in acting out in anger. Sometimes there's substance abuse involved. Sometimes it's shutting down, and being aware of those signs and really looking for them and looking for opportunities to break through with them, especially with teenagers. Teenagers are looking for an opportunity to understand who they are as individuals. They're trying to find their own identities, and that includes a process of pulling away from parents, right? Which can be really painful for the parent, and trying to understand what they need. And I think the most critical thing that we can do is to let these kids know we're here for them, to let them know when they're ready, we're here, to not force something, but to keep a door open. And also look for creative ways to engage, because again, I think my daughter is 12. What she is interested in is not what I am interested in. She does not have any interest in me writing her a handwritten letter or even playing her a song. She would be mortified, right? She would be absolutely mortified. But I recognize that she's in her own space and trying to figure things out with some of the loss that she has experienced growing up in the middle of a pandemic, and keeping that door open and giving her space to let me know when she needs something, I think is really helpful. But also knowing that sometimes she just wants me to look at a TikTok video with her, right? And that is really important to her, as much as I think TikTok is really silly. But it's a way that she connects, that I can connect with her without judgment, or without saying like, what a time waste, right? Why aren't you reading a book? Which isn't fair, because it's not necessarily my opinion, but the ways that sometimes we have a disconnect between adults and kids is just that we have different interests and don't recognize the importance of something to someone based on some differences between us. So keeping a door open and really making yourself available and reaching out in gentle ways, I think is really, really important for us to do. And part of that process also, in processing grief, in working through grief, in really being able to heal and move forward, is about us re-envisioning what our lives look like. Because here's the thing, as I said, grief is loss of expectation. Something we had planned for in our lives isn't going to happen. Whether that is losing someone that we love, or losing our job, or going through a separation in a relationship, whatever it is, we've experienced some loss, and it's not going to be a part of our lives. And we really need to consider, what is my life going to look like moving forward? And that is hard to do. But once we can re-envision what our life is going to look like, it gives us a space and a direction to move forward. It gives us an opportunity to say, okay, this is how it's going to be, and this is how I'm going to plan for it differently, so that we can let go of these expectations that can no longer be valid, right? And there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. And I'm always thinking about creativity, because like so many of us, I've always been someone who thought of myself as not being creative at all. I joke about being wounded by the macaroni wreath I made in kindergarten with the gold spray paint. We all made one of those, and how terrible it looked. Did not look good like the other kids, and was wounded and thought I could never be creative. And it's really surprising when we allow ourselves to define creativity for ourselves in our own space and what that looks like for us. and know that we can be creative in different ways. Because engaging in creative acts, when we allow ourselves to do that and say that I can be creative, maybe it's not through painting, but maybe it's through tending to my garden. Maybe it's not through, making music, but maybe it's through the things I put on my Pinterest board, right? I mean, Pinterest boards can be so beautiful and creative. And that is a lovely thing. We can be creative in so many different ways. And so when I talk about re-envisioning our lives, I think something we can do actually is create a vision board. And I teach workshops sometimes where I include this as an activity and an engagement, and participants who have never done something like that walk away feeling like this was amazing and I'm going to do vision boards all the time. And Pinterest is a very easy way to make a vision board. If you're someone who likes to engage things, on a computer, in a visual space, or, if you're someone who likes to do hands-on creative work, it's something you can do tearing up magazines and photos and things like that. But another part of re-envisioning our lives is really thinking about traditions that we've had that need to change. And how can we revise those? How can we create new rituals for ourselves? The last thing I will say, because I know that I need to leave a little time for question and answer, is that I talk about this, is that in my family, we have Holy Cannoli Day. Holy Cannoli Day is like, it's the thing we look forward to all year. We only do it at Christmas time. And all of the women in our family get together and we make cannolis. And it's like an all-day project. Like making cannolis is like back-breaking work. But we love it and it's so much fun and we all do it together. And not that the men in our family can't participate. They're just not interested. They just want to eat the product when it's done, right? But we all get together and we do this, and it's been a long family tradition, and it's had to change over time because it started with my grandmother. My grandmother's not here anymore. And my grandmother used to make dough by hand, and I use a KitchenAid mixer, because I don't think I'd have the strength to make dough by hand like my grandmother did, right? So it's shifted and it's changed, but it's continued on. And we can do that with our traditions and our rituals. And we need to think about what that looks like for us and how we can move on and carry on those rituals and the memory of the people that we love in these new ways. So I'm going to leave it there. And see if we have any questions or comments or concerns. Hopefully no concerns.
Yeah, we'll encourage everybody to put their questions in the chat, and then we can monitor those. And Abby, you can work with Gina and review them with everybody. So any questions?
Awesome. It looks like we have one, Gina, suggestions for when you get stuck in one of the tasks, and how do you get unstuck in a task of grief?
Well, I want to say that's an excellent question. And I think that, first of all, let me acknowledge to all of you that I am not a mental health professional. And a lot of the work that I come to comes from my background in spirituality and things like this. But I think that, first of all, I think it is really important for us to be working with someone that we know can offer us support, that we have to reach out to, whether that is a counselor or a therapist or, a close friend. Having that kind of support is critical. But if we get stuck, sometimes giving ourselves the space to sit down and think about why we are stuck. What is it that's going on for me that I'm stuck? Maybe you need to write it down. Maybe you need to do a vision board. Maybe you need to engage in some creative act or do something that allows you to force yourself to move forward in your process and give yourself the space. I say that a lot, give ourselves the space, because I am somebody, and I will tell you this, I am somebody, if I don't want to do it, I just don't want to do it, and I'll be stuck, right? And I just don't want to do it. And sometimes I have to say to myself, like, tough, do it. And whatever that is, yoga, running on my treadmill, whatever it is, once I do it, I'm like, thank God I did it. Thank God I made myself do it. It's hard to push ourselves to do it sometimes, but sometimes I think it's necessary.
We have, first, someone wants to know how they can order your cannolis. But on a more serious note, students dealing with grief, loss of a parent, family members, pets, etc. I mean, safety, security. What suggestions do you have to approach? I think they mean approaching, helping others go through grief if they're K-8 students.
K-8. Great question. So I want to also just refer back to the PDF that was sent out, where I listed, pages of different age groups and different things to look out for and to consider. But I think K-8 is a big, wide age range, right? And I think recognizing that kids at different ages are able to understand and process different things. So for instance, if you're talking about kids that are under 10, kids under 10 don't always understand what it means to say someone has passed away, right? That someone, a loved one is gone. It can be processed as somebody is sleeping, but it's going to come back eventually, right? Usually kids 10 and up are able to understand the finality of a death. And so understanding the ways kids process things at different ages is really, really critical, depending on who you're talking to. But I think that kids are a lot like adults in that they just want to know that you're there. They want to be engaged. They want somebody to say, hey, I've been thinking about you and I'm here for you, right? And so again, making yourself present and acknowledging yourself as being available, and acknowledging what a person is going through, a child. Like, I think it's really critical that we never say, I know what you're going through, because none of us knows what somebody else is going through. All of our experiences are different, right? But acknowledging what you're going through is really hard, and I'm here for you, and it's going to get better.
Cool. Thank you. That was great. So another question is, are the phases of grief different for children?
I do not believe they are. I do not believe they are different. I think that the stages are different. They're experienced in different ways, right? Because we process different things at different ages, but the stages themselves are not different.
Another question. First, another recommendation for Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist, which I guess I will now have to start watching.
Yes, it's so good. So good.
And then how can we start to address, in reference to the pandemic, how can we start to address this? And when they say it will be years to see the consequences on emotional health, what do you suggest doing now to make that process go smoother?
Well, I think that the most important thing, we can do for ourselves is to continually engage in self-maintenance and self-care, and thinking about what that looks like for ourselves in a time where we are quarantined, where we're not socially engaging the way that we are, that you can't necessarily go to your favorite restaurant, right? How do we redefine that for ourselves? and make sure that we're doing those kinds of things for ourselves. Because when we think of the long-term mental health effects and emotional health effects, those long-term effects are really, partially very much so going to be grounded in the ways that we are responding for ourselves every day. How are you showing up for yourself every day? What is it that you need to get out of bed in the morning? What is it that you need in the afternoon to get yourself through that last Zoom meeting, right? What is it you need to wind down at night? What are the things that you really miss? And how might you, again, be able to revise what that is? Revise your rituals, revise your traditions, and give yourself a space to experience that in a new way. The more that we can show up for ourselves, and of course, show up for our kids and show up for the people that we love on a daily basis, the better we are going to prepare ourselves to come out of this trauma in a way where we're really in a place to continue to move forward in a positive direction.
We had another comment about how there was a suicide and now they're looking to move past that and they're looking for resources. I wanted to touch on first, we have parentguidance.org, which we're partnered with. And that is a really, really great resource for adults and families to go through and, learn about how to go through stages of grief based on specific subjects. So you're grieving the loss of someone, or you're grieving, just your own process in general. It's very specific. So I recommend that. But as far as turning the question over to you, Dr. Messina, any creative options for ninth graders? Beth looks like she mentioned using a support group or something along those lines. Do you have any other ideas?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that when we're talking about grief, people who are grieving a loved one who has committed suicide, it's not just grief, it is trauma, right? That is a trauma that you are dealing with when you have a sudden loss as a result of such a devastation. Understanding the trauma that comes with it is really critical. Because when you have traumatic grief, you're not just grieving, you're also oftentimes reliving some moment of the experience. So it might be reliving the moment of hearing this person passed away because they had committed suicide. Just hearing such a statement, right, can be very, very traumatic, and something that we might play over in our heads that gives us that feeling of cringing and can be so painful. So acknowledging that there's multiple pieces that a person is dealing with in such a tragedy is so important. And I think having support groups, giving a space for kids to come together and talk with each other about their experience is such a healthy thing. It's such a healthy and wonderful, wonderful thing. And also, I think looking for opportunities for them to express their emotions in a creative way is very powerful. I think it can be far more powerful than we realize. I'm at Ursuline College, and we have an art therapy program. And it is the program that I am always the most impressed with and excited with in the things that they are doing with children and adults in ways of processing trauma and grief and working through that. So looking at creative processes, I think, would be really powerful.
Great, and that puts us perfectly to our time mark. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Messina, and thank you for everybody who came on and attended this webinar. I'm going to drop my email in the chat. If you are not a Hope Squad advisor or have access to the advisor portal, you can email me and I will send you a copy of this recording. But thank you all for joining us. And once again, thanks, Dr. Messina, for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. And thank you, everybody who came today. Don't hesitate to reach out and connect in some other way.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.